So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to the first free-for-all that I've done in quite some time. And I just felt like, considering I had a couple of free-for-alls in the backlog, that I did want to do one, and it does make for a good palate cleanser between all of these larger scale sieges that we have been seeing of late. And also this one has a rather clear theme, because we're going to be dealing with three factions of elves, and you will get to pick your favourite flavour of elf on this occasion. And it's going to be between Mirkwood, Lothlorien and Imladris, so Linden the ones that do miss out, but I do feel as though Linden are the ones that are the most difficult to play anyway. So here we will be seeing who is going to be the strongest of the other three. The eagle-eyed amongst you as well may actually recognise this map as the one that Horton edited a little bit for his most recent scenario, which by this point will probably have happened a couple of weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks ago by the time this replay comes out. So he did add a few bits and pieces here and there though, but the same theme does apply. We will be seeing a lot more action down here in the middle of the valley this time though, I think. But it is worth saying that I think the Lothlorien elves are the ones that are going to be starting off with the most advantageous terrain, because they can actually get on top of this hill, and indeed they have already decided to place one of their units of archers up here. The Kindred of Caliborn are a very strong unit of archers to place up there as well, so they start with a little bit of an advantage, but that can be a bit of a double-edged sword in a free-for-all, because if you start with an advantageous position and it looks like you're going to do well, the other players will have a tendency of ganging up on you, and that can be something which is so difficult to weather through. But we shall have to wait and see. Other than that, I don't know how much of this map we're necessarily going to see. Like I said, I feel as though most of the battle is going to take place in and around this bend on the road in this valley here. It's a smaller battle as well, which again is in stark contrast to the vast majority of battles I've been doing lately, which have been 40k frame plus monstrosities that have taken quite a lot of time. So yeah, this is just a little bit of something different before we head back into, I'm sure, business as usual. And this one was sent to me by Farquit over here, who's going to be playing as Mirkwood. Mirkwood have the lowest armour value among these elves, at the very least. They obviously outclass Linden, but they are going to be outclassed in terms of armour by both Lothlorien and certainly Imladris, but they also have very good melee defence to make up for this. Whether this is going to be enough to give them the overall edge in melee remains to be seen. It kind of depends on what sort of infantry they've brought. The Hiri Lung are a pretty good statement of intent though, even though they don't have the armour upgrade here, which does make them fairly vulnerable to missile fire given Mirkwood's rather obvious shortcomings. They are still going to be very good in melee, but if it comes down to a pure brawl between heavy swordsmen and perhaps heavy line infantry like these Hiri Alth over here, their shields make them a little bit better against archers and the like. But as I was saying, if it does become a brawl between the heavier elven infantry, you would have to back Imladris of these three. But Mirkwood of course have got plenty of other units that they can put around such things to support them. A couple of units of Spears of Emondwyr. We also have the mighty Elven King's Palace Guard with the armour upgrade as well, perhaps the most well-rounded single unit of infantry of any of the Elven factions really, because they have armour piercing, very nice anti-cavalry bonus, and also just really high damage in general. There are better specialists than them, like the Gwathi Myrdain are going to be the better armour piercing infantry and the like, but even so, the Palace Guard are going to be a very dangerous foe to fight. And we have the Elders of the Elven King hiding back here as well with their Silverthorn arrows. So relatively small armies here, not a great deal of funds, and you have to say Mirkwood have gone for a very up-close and personal army considering what they're usually all about. But having smaller armies like this also does mean that they're going to have to perhaps be a little bit more careful with how they decide to approach things. All of the factions are actually going to have to do that, and going for all in for infantry means you do have the option of just blitzing someone down, which perhaps the other forces will not have. Now we have DFJ, who, like I said, starts off with the most advantageous position on the battlefield. He's got some Loreland Axemen, which in comparison to the Hiri Alth we've already seen have slightly better armour and well, better attack because of the axes that they wield, but they also have lower melee defence, which could yet play a part. But for the most part they will be doing things largely the same as their contemporaries. The differences between quality will largely be nominal, but they are still significant enough. Like Imladris will have the slight edge in some areas that you will have to watch out for. Carascaladon's Guardian, so if things do come down to a grind fest in the late game, you'd have to say Lothlorien have positioned themselves very well with this kind of unit. The multiple HP puts them above and beyond anything any of the others can bring in terms of a Phalanx unit. Mirkwood of course can't bring a Phalanx unit at all. Imladris can, very good ones at that, but none of them are quite on the level of the multiple HP that the Carascaladon's Guardians can muster. It's really only the Dwarves with their First Legion Pikes with that armour piercing that can do that. Also got some Loreland Warriors, I think a must bring in this situation, because if you do find yourself having to go toe to toe with Imladris, that armour piercing will be incredibly useful for you. It might be as well that there was actually a rule around only bringing a certain number of certain kinds of units. It's quite a coincidence that Lothlorien have also only brought one skirmisher and it's a bodyguard archer unit. He has upgraded their armour. They've got split shots, unlike the Silverthorns. Personally, if I had to pick between the two Lothlorien bodyguard units, I probably would go for the Watchers, just because there are a few more of them. They're a little bit better in melee. Yes, the split shots are potentially more damaging, but I think considering the numbers are what they are, everyone's going to have to chip in melee, and I think the Watchers just offer a little bit more there, but not to say the Kindred are going to underperform, especially with that armour upgrade that they have at their disposal. And finally, last but by no means least, we have Filler, who is going to be playing as Imladris. Swords of Rivendell with the armour upgrade, so maybe going for slightly more in terms of numbers here, Imladris, unlike the enemies they're going to be facing today. The Swords of Rivendell may struggle a little bit, even with their armour upgrade, up against the heavier units that Mirkwood and Lothlorien seem to have based their strategy around. But it does mean they'll have more mobility on the battlefield, they'll be able to get around lines a little bit more easily. Yeah, once again, I assume there was a rule around archers, because we're seeing only one for Imladris, and again it is a bodyguard tier 1. God Helim Einauer, who do not have their armour upgrade either, but they're much along the same lines as the Elders of the Elven King, albeit, well, they have their Silverthorn arrows, but they are more defensive in melee, being a sword and board bodyguard when they get up close and personal, whereas the Elders of the Elven King pull out a two-handed Elven curved blade. In behind, we have the Gwaith I Arthand and the Gwaith I Mirdain, so 2 units of bodyguard infantry here, which sets them apart perhaps from the others, which is where they have made their sacrifice, obviously. With the Swords of Rivendell in the front, they don't have like a full line of Imladris Guardians, which would give parity between themselves and their 2 opponents, but they do have 2 bodyguard units as a result. The Gwaith I Arthand are very defensive, very tough to kill. They do need to be careful about the armour-piercing elements that both of their opponents do have, but if they can avoid those, honestly, they can weather pretty much any storm, which is what sets Imladris apart after all. And the Gwaith I Mirdain, they don't have their armour upgrade either, but that, again, like I said, they are a better specialist armour-piercing infantry bodyguard unit when you compare them with the Elven Kings, or the Palace Guard, I should say. Again, I would still say that they do need to be careful of stuff like the Carascaladon's Guardians as well, though, because you really don't want these guys getting bogged down on the front of those Lothlorien pikes. It also does mean Lothlorien are quite likely to be fairly static in this fight, however. And we also have some Broinen River Wards, which are a little bit more akin to the Hiri Lan that we already saw. No Lothlorien heavy swordsmen, they've instead opted for the armour piercing that Lothlorien get pretty much exclusively. But yeah, it's going to be interesting this. I mean, Mirkwood having to go so heavily into melee, given that there is only 1 archer apiece, is going to be quite interesting, because that's where perhaps you would expect them to maybe be at their weakest, but I mean, consequently they do have the highest average melee defense as well, and considering there's so few archers on the field, unless they're unfortunate enough to be focused down by both of their foes, that melee defense could really come back to help them. It may even have been a battle actually that Lyndon would have done quite well in, considering the restrictions here. Lothlorien are quite likely to be defensive, like I said, with those pikes and the heavier units, and they may try to save their Lorinard warriors for later, get a good charge off. 1 good charge could be the difference maker, and obviously with their Kindred, they're certainly going to be defensive based on the initial positioning of them, and they're almost certainly going to shoot into Imladris immediately. Imladris, I think, have to try and dictate the pace here. I think Mirkwood will try to go around the Lothlorien position to a certain extent, but Imladris will have to move forward almost immediately, right into Lothlorien. I think Mirkwood could end up being the kingmakers here, because if they go after Imladris, they may very well hand the game to Lothlorien on a silver platter. I don't think they will, based on the fact that the player told me that this one was an incredibly competitive battle. Lothlorien, I don't know. Putting yourself in this position can often paint a target on your back, but it'll be interesting to see what's actually going to happen here. But yeah, without further ado, enough waffling, let's begin. So we do actually have a blank fire here from the start, so I assume there is a little bit of a grace period as all 3 factions decide what it is they want to do. The Kindred of Celeborn can't simply start opening up on both of their foes immediately. I'm going to be interested to see, as I've said in the army composition phase, whether or not Lothlorien have painted a huge target on their backs by doing this, because as soon as the grace period is over, the Kindred of Celeborn are going to shoot into Imladris' formation. Probably the best choice is to shoot into Imladris as well, given the fact that they have elected to invest quite heavily in the Swords of Rivendell as their main line, which may very well mean that Imladris, for once, might be the lightest faction on the field amongst this company, at least on average. When you consider the Imladris bodyguard units, that may become slightly different. The Kindred of Celeborn now reloading, and presumably are going to be shooting into the Swords of Rivendell. And instead, Imladris are going to be taking a bit of a turn as well to try and take a little bit of cover, but this will mean that they're shepherded into the welcoming arms of Mirkwood, and this may end up working out quite nicely for Lothlorien if Imladris and Mirkwood do not cotton on to what's going on here. You can see over here the Elders of the Elven King also shooting into the Swords of Rivendell. Now, Filler may not mind this too much, because while he is going to be taking the only losses of the game early on here, It is only going to be on his Swords of Rivendell, which may mean his bodyguard units can start to do the business later on. The God Helene taking a little bit of damage, but they will be far better equipped to deal with this than most others, and indeed a lot of these Kindred of Celeborn volleys are going to go wide if they shoot into a small unit that's in loose formation. We are of course going to be making liberal use as well of half speed in this battle, because it is going to be very quick, but also very chaotic and widespread. Lorenar Axemen charging into the Spears of Emendwyr and into the Hiriath. Now this is a fight that Lothlorien are going to really quite enjoy. The Spears of Emendwyr are going to be no match in melee against the high damage Lorenar Axemen, but also against the Hiriath when they don't have their armour upgrade. That base damage of the Lorien Axemen is going to be really a real problem for Mirkwood to have to try and deal with. Now the Hiri Lang are going to have to try and go around the outside and flank them, but the Karas Galadon's Guardians are on the way forward as well. Interestingly enough, the Kindred of Celeborn probably don't have the best of shots up here now. They have got a relatively linear arc of fire, but they also stand a pretty good chance of hitting their own men in the back, to be honest. Lorenar Axemen charging in over here as well. Once again, they'll do really nicely against the Swords of Rivendell. But against the Broinen River Wards with that armour, I mean, they are unshielded, so that will still be a decent amount of damage from the archers, but the Broinen River Wards probably fancy their chances against the Lorenar Axemen. It is interesting, actually. See over there that the God Helene are shooting into the backs of the Karas Galadon's Guardians, and also the Elders of the Elven King shooting into them, so actually it may be the Mirkwood and Imladris archers that end up getting the most value for money in the long run here, in spite of the superior elevation that the Kindred of Celeborn currently have. Now the Karas Galadon's Guardians need to sort themselves out. They're getting shot by 2 units of Silverthorn archers, which is going to make manoeuvring a little bit more difficult, but if they are going to continue to get shot and they're going to get engaged in melee up close and personal by a unit of Hiri Lang, they may not be as effective as the Lorien player wants them to be. Now here on the front line, the Lorenar Axemen balance of forces is going to be evenly matched for the time being. The Hiri Lang are going to leave that front line, however. Something that we haven't really paid too much attention to is this melee engagement over here between Imladris and Mirkwood, which says it's going to be even. A large part of that is probably down to the armour piercing of the Elven King's Palace Guard. See the Swords of Rivendell still doing their thing as well, with the Gwaithir Arthand holding things down on the front line as well. So a bit more of a defensive formation this from Imladris, just trying to hold back the higher damage Mirkwood forces from sweeping through their formations. The God Helene here, so I can only assume that the Gwaithir Myrdain are over here, and indeed they are, and they have absolutely demolished the front line of Lorien over here. Even the Lorenar warriors who were committed against Imladris to try and provide that armour-piercing bite. It hasn't gone too well for Lorien on this front, because they haven't had the necessary strength to deal with a unit as strong as the Gwaithir Myrdain. And the Broinen River Wards as well are over here, and the Kindred of Celeborn maybe haven't been quite as damaging as they would like. Keren Amroth's Staff Masters revealing themselves though, so a couple of units of Lorien infantry that were hidden, but perhaps splitting and going into wave-based attacks like this isn't going to be the best thing for Lorien. I think they need to consolidate a little bit, otherwise they're going to end up losing on both front lines to Mirkwood and Imladris, and at that point the only hope they really have is to hope that Mirkwood and Imladris will then prioritise one another. Hiriath continuing to fight on the front line resolutely, but the Lorenar Axemen are slowly but surely gaining the upper hand, as I feared they might over here against Mirkwood. So while Mirkwood may be gaining, there's a bit of a symmetry in this fight. Mirkwood losing to Lorien but beating Imladris. Imladris losing to Mirkwood but beating Lorien. And also one unit of archers around. It's a strange kind of fight this is, very different to the sort that we usually see, in that the devil is very much going to be in the details in this fight. Very small gains can have a very profound impact in this kind of fight. And it's going to be that sort of thing which separates the winners from the losers in this one ultimately. Kindred of Celeborn showering their projectiles down once again on the Gwaithir Myrdain and the Swords of Rivendell. Interestingly enough, they're taking some shots in the side from the Elders of the Elven King, so a bit of peripheral support in many ways from Mirkwood there. Mirkwood would be infinitely better off trying to target down the Gwaithir Myrdain in this sort of situation though, because they represent such a threat. And the Keren Amroth's Staff Masters are very quickly falling by the wayside. God Helene getting into position, Swords of Rivendell pursuing the routing Lorien units. We're going to, I guess, try and get up there against the Kindred of Celeborn. Meanwhile, the Gwaithir Arthand defeat is almost a certainty. The Elven King's Palace Guard very slowly will bring the Gwaithir Arthand down. If there's one thing this unit of High Elven Spears is going to be very good at, it's going to be withstanding an awful lot of punishment. But they will ultimately be defeated. But more reinforcements arrive from Imladris. The Broynin Riverwards turning around after their victory over Lothlorien on the other front, doubling back to try and help out against Mirkwood. So that Imladris muscle has borne out so far, you'd have to say. They've done pretty well for themselves thus far, but is that going to be enough to carry them through to ultimate victory in this fight? Whatever happens to the Carascaladon's Guardians, they are now in melee at the very least. Having already taken a little bit of damage, they are now getting onto the front line to try and secure Lorien's victory on this front against the Mirkwood forces. The Hiri Lang coming back onto the front line to help out against the Loren Armed Axemen. This unit of Karen Amroth Staffmasters is blocking the passage of this unit of Hiri Lang to also try and turn the tide against Lorien on that front line. Elves of the Elven King will make quick work of the Staffmasters, but they're really just here to buy time and little else. Over here, Gwaithir Myrdain still doing their thing, the God Helene moving forward. Still, that Kindred of Celeborn has been firing for a long time, but I'm not sure they've really been as effective as both of the two units of Mirkwood and Imladris archers, who have been closer to the fight, getting really nice shots off. So, based on the fact that the engagement has happened so far away from the Kindred of Celeborn and the split shots get further away from one another the longer they have to shoot, maybe it hasn't been the blessing that Lothlorien would have hoped it would have been. And now their infantry is horribly exposed to the God Helene. Interestingly enough, Mirkwood actually going to give Lothlorien a bit of a helping hand as the Hiri Lang charging in to the God Helene. The God Helene should be more than enough to deal with those Hiri Lang, especially with the Gwaithir Myrdain close by. You need to be very, very careful. And the Gwaithir Arthand withstanding the Palace Guard so far, although I think a big part of that is the fact that the Palace Guard were already a little bit roughed up, and also the rest of the Imladris line is also doing very nicely. Elves of the Elven King are going to try and get in position to, I guess, help out against the Gwaithir Arthand. So far, Imladris probably the happiest of all the Elven factions. Lothlorien probably the least happy. Mirkwood somewhere in the middle, but things can change pretty rapidly in a free-for-all, and we're not even halfway through yet, so much can still happen. Hiri Lang going to bring down the Karen Amroth Staffmasters. Mirkwood actually victorious against Lothlorien in the end over here as well, so I mean the Carascaladon's Guardians pulling off the front line to regroup with the Kindred of Celeborn, who are presumably out of ammunition at this point, but yeah, Lorien needs consolidate at this point and hope that Mirkwood and Imladris knock 7 bells out of one another before this fight is over. Moving over here, Spears of Amadouir, not many of them left, but there are a few more Hiri Alth. Gwaithir Myrdain cut off and behind enemy lines at this stage, so they'll probably be overwhelmed by the amount of Mirkwood infantry that there still are over here. Bring it down to half speed once again with all of this movement that's happening on the field now. Elven King's Palace Guard continuing to face off against the Gwaithir Arthand, who are now starting to fall away a little bit more quickly. That's a sign that the second hit point has been worn away, and over time the Imladris spears will ultimately be defeated, but I mean by the time they are defeated the Palace Guard themselves will be thoroughly bloodied, and they won't be the same sort of force on the field as they once were, and this may ultimately leave Lorien to have the high tier unit advantage. The Elves of the Elven King might have something to say about that. I mean, slowly but surely momentum in this fight maybe is shifting away from Imladris a little bit. Moving over here, Gwaithir Arthand is still there. Kindred of Celeborn running down from the hills. I'm going to assume they're going to go after the God Helene. And the Carascaladon's Guardians, I mean, what are they going to do? Lorien don't really want to commit anything to this melee fight over here until both of their foes have been sufficiently weakened, I would suggest. Gwaithir Myrdain. Defeat is almost a certainty. Bouncer Force is evenly matched. I mean, with every swing of those hammers, they're going to be dealing good damage, but Mirkwood less susceptible to that armor-piercing damage than Lothlorien would be, and have been. The God Helene charging in, trying to prevent this wrapping up of the line from the Elders of the Elven King. Of the two units, in terms of damage dealing potential, you'd actually back the Elders, but the God Helene do have that resilience, even without the armour upgrade. That shield may help them, but the Kindred of Celeborn coming in here may help Mirkwood out a lot here. because they are going to charge in here, and ultimately it's going to be the God Helene that pay the price. I really do like the armour upgrade for the Kindred of Caliborn as the dual-wielding unit gets involved. Sword and shield, dual-wielder, and two-handed swordsman all together. Karas Galadon's Guardians are still here. The Gwaithir Arthand at this stage. The Gwaithir Myrdain push back to fight side by side with their High Elven brethren. But yeah, the battle does seem to be turning against Imladris the further along that it goes. Mirkwood may be fancying their chances now with the numbers they still have at their disposal. I mean, I do think Lothlorien need to be a little bit more careful about what they do, and I think they see this because they're going to pull away from the God Helene, and instead they may elect to try and face off against Mirkwood here. Again, they need to be a little bit careful here, Mirkwood and Imladris as well, because if they allow Lothlorien to retain a decent amount of Karas Galadon's Guardians for the late game pikes, always such a difficult foe to bring down. Kindred of Caliborn charging in here, that they will do a lot of damage to what remains of the Mirkwood units here. Elves of the Elven King pulling off the front line. I think at this point it's just a matter of who can play this game in the most clever fashion. Who can sequester one of their most powerful units away somewhere. But also it's a matter of not pulling too much off the front line so that someone doesn't really gain a big advantage. Elven King's Palace Guard also pulling away. Imladris able to retain some of their high tier units as well. The Karas Galadon's Guardians suffering a charge from the Elders of the Elven King. Farquaad perhaps realising the threat that the Lothlorien pikemen pose for later. Still those Hiriauth as well, manoeuvring around this stack which sits near this engagement, offers a little bit of cover for those that want to use it. Elven King's Palace Guard facing off against the Kindred of Caliborn, but the Kindred of Caliborn, considering that they aren't as battle weary, maybe will have the wherewithal to defeat the Palace Guard. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, it is still going to be a narrow fight, and the armour upgrade won't help them quite so much against the armour piercing of those glaives, and there's still a lot of other Mirkwood units around here. In fact, the Kindred of Caliborn are a little bit surrounded, but Lorien can't really do much about that. They only have one other unit on the field at this point, and they are currently busy trying to face off against the Elders. Interestingly enough, the Gwaithir Arthand now coming in here to try and help out. There goes the Mirkwood General. Fortuitous for the Kindred of Caliborn there. They really don't want Lorien to retain these pikes for the late game, understandably so. The Hiriauth will of course be defeated by what remains of the God Helene. This could still go any which way. Maybe a slight edge at this point in proceedings from Mirkwood. Kindred of Caliborn going around to try and regroup with their pike brethren, and try and also help bring an ultimate end to the Elders of the Elven King. Mirkwood's General being lost is an interesting one, because you can see the Elders are shaken up. Given the kind of units that are on the field, a chain rout is maybe unlikely given that it's Elves, but it can happen, it can still make a difference, so that Mirkwood's General is the first to fall could be significant. Thranduil being edgy, holding his swords with a backward grip. Victory almost a certainty for the Kindred now. 26 Palace Guard remain. The Elders do end up routing, that is significant. The Gwaithir Arthand are still right in here. Could it come down to just sheer attrition? And in which case those Imladris spears could be the ultimate match winners for the High Elves. God Helene, they are taking losses at the hands of the Mirkwood Elves over here. There's still 4 Gwaithir Myrdain, which, given the margins are what they are, that could be, I mean, running someone through with a hammer, that's pretty grisly, but that could be a very significant thing. There's still 17 Karas Galadon's Guardians, and now that they and the Kindred of Caliborn are fighting side by side, it's how the tables turn quickly, because now Mirkwood probably are in the weakest position on the field, and it may yet come down to just one singular mosh pit fight. Chaldea still lives, sword in hand, running through one of the Palace Guardsmen. 15 God Helene, 17 Gwaithir Arthand, and a few Gwaithir Myrdain. It's only the very best of the Imladris units that remain. only the very best of the Lothlorien units that remain. The Palace Guard are here also, but Mirkwood also have to depend on a unit of merely high-tier units rather than bodyguard units in the Hiri Lang, hoping that those two-handed swords will be enough to inflict some kind of damage. And at this point, yeah, it is just everyone banging into one another in a triangle shape, rather fittingly, just to see who can come out victorious. What is going on over here? Hiri Lang routing and broken. So Mirkwood are feeling the effects of losing that general. I don't believe there's much else. There's one single Karen Amroth Staff Master who for the time being is keeping outside the engagement. Perhaps he's thinking if he can keep just a singular unit away, he's got some sort of insurance policy, Jay. I really don't believe there's anything else. I don't think those Hiri Lang will be returning from routing with only 7. Groin and River Wards are routing off as well, so even though Imladris still have their general, it's not enough to prevent routing. When you fight the best, everyone is going to be set towards routing. There's the Imladris general, toe to toe with the Kindred. Elrond and Haldir still alive, Thranduil less so. Still 13 Gwaith Arthan, so they are dying, but they are taking a while about it. And it's all over the place here. There's Palace Guard against God Halim over here, Gwaith Arthan facing off against Kindred of Celeborn and Karas Galadon's Guardians over here. There's more of the God Halim there, there's more of the Palace Guard there, who are continuing to fight hard. They really need to hope that their Hiri Lang that are still fighting alongside them don't rout, even despite the odds that lay before them. Still that one Staff Master over there, who remains unmoved at this point. I'm not sure Lothlorien, the Kindred of Celeborn are almost completely gone. Karas Galadon's Guardian's almost completely gone, so it's looking like Lothlorien might be the first to fall actually. Those losses they took earlier on both of those front lines may yet come back to haunt them. Yes, they had their highest tier units available, but not much else in terms of support. Imladris went heavier into their bodyguard units in general anyway, so maybe the numbers that these Hiri Lang are offering might yet be significant. But I would still say maybe this clever money might be on Imladris here, but well, there goes Haldir. That may very well be the final nail in Lothlorien's coffin. Still 13 God Halim, 12 Gwaith Arthan. It's a big ask, but if any unit can do it, maybe the Palace Guard can. The Kindred of Celeborn do rout in the end, and the Staff Master ultimately has been engaged in melee. They've got a ridiculously high melee defense, but he's attracted the attention of one of the God Halim and a fair few of the Hiri Lang now. The God Halim ends up falling, but surely these Mirkwood swordsmen will be enough to bring Lothlorien down, so they're not completely out of this yet. If somehow that one Staff Master can win through, I'd be very surprised, but yeah, I think the clever money would be on the more resilient Imladris here, who ultimately in this chaotic three-way battle in the infantry, maybe their higher defense and their slightly better armor, especially with their bodyguard units, has ultimately ended up paying dividends. And there's still 2 Palace Guard, 10 Hiri Lang. To be fair, there's only 10 Gwaith Arthan remaining, 8 God Halim. I mean, it's going to be an incredibly close margin this, but that's kind of what you'd expect given the overall sizes of the armies at the start. Imladris still have their general as well, which the general himself, with the general's raised stats as an individual, might yet prove to be a big difference maker. We've seen that happen before in a Siege of Edoras, where the Rohirrim general ended up making a huge difference. That may end up being the case here with Elrond himself. Blade drawn, Gwaith Arthan rallying around Elrond. Lothlorien are now gone. So it now does, as we perhaps suspected, come down to a straight shootout between Imladris and Mirkwood. I'd be very impressed with the Hiri Lang if they were able to pull this out of the bag, to be honest. Still a red star over here. Notice the Kindred of Celeborn are running away, 2 of them.
interestingly enough, 2 Kindred of Celeborn might have been enough to give Lothlorien a fighting chance in this battle, given how little remains of everyone's units at this point. God, Helene continue to fight. As does Elrond with those 5 Gwaith the Arthand. Victory seems certain at this point. Maybe rallying around and allowing Mirkwood to surround in this manner wasn't the wisest choice. 9 Hiri Lang are all that remains. All the Palace Guard are gone, actually, so it's just the heavy swordsmen for Mirkwood that are still here. Do the Gwaith the Arthand have the attack necessary? Do the God Helene have the attack necessary to pull this out? This would be a very impressive victory for Mirkwood, and it would go to show actually the benefits of the high damage that these swordsmen have, because surely the Gwaith the Arthand and God Helene no longer have any HP remaining. And that means it is just mano a mano, as it were. They can't rely on that bodyguard privilege to see them through. Elrond himself might yet have something to say about this, though. He needs to actually land some hits. Parried, and now another Sylvan Elf joins the fight. Yeah, Mirkwood may very well be able to pull this out of the bag. Three God Helene. Just 2 Gwaith the Arthand now, and only 1 Hiri Lang has fallen since last we checked. That high base melee defense of these swordsmen, as well as the high base attack, it's proving to be too much, and in the end that higher priority on defense for Imladris might end up being their undoing. It saw them into a pretty strong position here in the late game, but it might not be enough to see them over the line completely. They may yet rout, of course, as well, the Hiri Lang. The lack of a general. Elrond himself standing before you. There was another one of them though. Yeah, this is going to be a Mirkwood victory. It's only Elrond himself and 1 of his retinue that remains, and that's going to be too much. There's too many of the Hiri Lang that are left. Elrond kills 1 of them. 7 Hiri Lang versus 1 Elrond. Surely it's going to be too much. And with the amount of frames that are left, you would have to assume that a rout might be in order if Mirkwood are to lose, and with a kill, maybe that's not beyond the realms of possibility. They're exhausted, but so too is the Imladris general. As the elves go about kicking him to death. Gangland style killing. Oh, and he's down. Yeah, they're stun locking him to death here. Doesn't have the relentless trait, Elrond, and that surely is going to be enough for Mirkwood to be victorious. 6 swordsmen remain, and they do win. Mirkwood victorious with only 6 elves left standing. That was a very, very close battle. I mean, we've seen closer, I would say, just because we've seen that kind of margin before in like 5v3 sieges, but it is very rare, and even here it's worth remarking upon because of how fine the margins were. Really, if Imladris had done something slightly different to be slightly more efficient, that would have been enough to give them the victory here. Lothlorien, I really feel as though putting their archers up on their high ground wasn't the benefit that they thought it would be, just based on the fact that the engagement happened further away from them, and in the end I think the Elves of the Elven King and the God Helene both had better games than the Kindred of Celeborn did. Maybe it would have been different if it wasn't the split shot projectiles, and that means it would have been a little bit more pinpoint accurate and the arrows weren't spreading out quite so much. Again, I feel as though the Watchers of the Golden Wood would have been the better choice just for that. Stylistically, I do like the Kindred, but the Watchers I think would have been the better call here for Jay. I think that would have been one way in which Lothlorien could have had a better showing. They, of course, the first of the Elven armies to fall. Imladris, so fine with the margins. I don't think you can have too many complaints, but yeah, Mirkwood, that extra bit of damage, that melee defense focus was enough for them to ultimately end up winning. So if you're rooting for Mirkwood, Some people may have been, because I know that the Palace Guard as a singular unit might be the most popular in the whole game, but I also know as a faction Imladris probably have the most admirers, so I'm not sure. Maybe I will get complained at in the comments because Imladris lost. Wouldn't be the first time. Let's have a look and see what did the damage for Mirkwood. Yeah, the Elders of the Elven King, those archers, definitely doing the business there. The Palace Guard themselves having a good game. Hiri Lang, they were the heroes in the end, but they didn't actually get as many kills as the Hiri Alth, but I feel as though that may be because they were the Hiri Alth were more of a mainstay in the early game when the armies were bigger. And of course the Spears of Amenduir, you have to accept the fact that, you know, basic units of spears amongst this kind of company, they were almost certainly the weakest melee combatants on the field, so the fact that they ended up getting that many kills is probably acceptable for Mirkwood, certainly acceptable for Mirkwood, given the fact that Farkwood here managed to win. So yeah, in the end I think those Silverthorn arrows did the trick. So big thank you to Farkwood for sending this one in to me. Definitely something a little bit different, certainly a shorter battle in terms of time elapsed and in terms of the amount of units that we saw on the field today, but it's been a while since I've done a free-for-all, and I've done several large-scale sieges in a row. This is also a little bit easier to record in midweek, which is what I'm doing at the moment, where I'm just recording this one battle before I go off to make my dinner. Nvidia themselves actually almost put paid to that when once again they reared their ugly incompetent heads, and I had to fiddle around with the settings once again just so that I could record. But such is the way of things. Every time Nvidia so much as look at making any sort of changes to their GeForce experience, it always makes it worse. Again, much in the same way as most other software developers, they can't seem to leave well enough alone when they have a good thing going on. But such is the way of things. I suppose I shouldn't really bite the hand that feeds me too much, but it is what it is. But yeah, easier to record a game like this in midweek, and it does give me that little bit of extra leeway moving forwards. As for the next replay that I'm going to be doing, I think we will be making a return to Rebuilt Osgiliath, so that will almost certainly be the next one that we do. There is one that I could do on Moria, which was a little bit more recent, but it was also one that was curtailed by crashing, so I would be interested to see if that was the case again. So yeah, we maybe not right after the rebuild of Osgiliath, but certainly within the next couple of weeks or so, after this replay is shown, you can expect to see Moria once again. I know it's not to everyone's taste, but it is iconic, and I would like to make up for the fact that the last one did have those technical difficulties. There is one that is merely marked as First Age Battle. I don't know if that's a siege or not. Maybe if it is, we'll also see that one in the coming days as well. And I did also get sent something by Kamul, Lord of the Eastlings, which was very likely to be another Silmarillion replay actually, so we may see another Silmarillion replay sooner than I would have expected. It's possible anyway. We'll have to wait and see on that one. Irregardless, other than that, I think moving into the latter part of the year, based on what I'm seeing, I may have to delay getting new hardware until the early part of next year rather than the later part of this one. So certainly before April of next year I'll be looking to upgrade at least a little bit. But I probably won't be able to do it at the tail end of this year. With that being the case, when I come back from the big trip away in mid-October, what I might be doing, I may not be immediately going into some Rise of Mordor battles, but I might be going through, as I used to for Reforged, faction overviews and maybe some top 10s or top 5s, depending on how many units there are per category. And I can do that because Attila's mechanics are somewhat more simple than Medieval 2. It's a lot easier to quantify, so I can look into that a little bit more easily. Faction overviews and the like. Maybe I could do that for Rise of Mordor, because that will be less demanding on my current system and I would be able to do it. So that might be a good opener for Rise of Mordor, to be honest, if I start by doing content like that before going into stuff like battle replays. So that's the sort of thing that you can maybe expect to start to see come November time. Might be good to enter into the rotation, but certainly stuff like Bannerlord content will be pushed back a little bit further as a result of me having to delay getting new hardware by a couple of months or so. But yeah, other than that, there's nothing really to talk about with the channel, and I will be going through all of this in a little bit more detail in a channel update in the future, which I will take the form of a live stream, I think, because that one I'd like to be a little bit more interactive, unlike the last one where I was just being a little bit more matter of fact, which going down to one video a week is the sort of thing which may only happen for 1 or 2 weeks towards the middle of October, like I said, because I'm trying to record as much as possible so I can cover the whole 4 weeks that I'm away, but it may not be entirely possible. We'll have to wait and see.
But yeah, big thank you to Farkwood once again. Big thank you to both of the other players that were a part of this very, very close free-for-all. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. And I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.